So we are still making the butter bell. I have flipped it over so that I can throw the knob on the top of it. I thought I'd talk to you real quick about IP in the context of podcasts. What IP is involved in a podcast? Well, there's lots of bits and pieces, and I'm not going to get into all of it because there's the issue of whether you should use music in a podcast and how to get licensing rights for that. All that. The thing I'd like to talk to you about is whether you should have your podcast guests sign any kind of paperwork before they appear. And the answer to that question, in my opinion anyway, take that with a grain of salt. This is not legal advice for you specifically, but generally it's a good idea to have a contract for any kind of business relationship before you get too deep. Get a contract to set forth the expectations and understanding of the parties. So, what kind of contract do you need for your podcast guests, you may be wondering? And I'll answer that question for you. You want to make sure you have something in writing that gives you the right to use the podcast guest's name and likeness in not just the podcast itself, but also in promoting and marketing your podcast, because you want to be able to say, so-and-so appeared on the podcast, come and listen. You need to be able to have the right to use their name to do that. So you want to get a name and likeness license, and you also want to have, this is too wet for me to be doing what I'm doing, you also want to have something in there that talks about who owns the intellectual property rights in the podcast, specifically the copyrights. So you want to make sure that they say in their agreement with you that you, as the podcast creator, own the copyrights in the podcast, and you have exclusive rights to do whatever you want to with it as the copyright owner. So they can't then later prevent you from doing certain things, from splicing, editing, modifying the podcast because they don't like how you did it. As a guest on the podcast, they may well have some copyrights in it unless you have them sign that release. So before you have somebody come and appear on your podcast, have them sign an agreement that addresses at the very least, those two issues.